Good evening and welcome to We Got Talent News for You. Thank you everybody for joining us both on the live broadcast and later viewers. As always, can I remind you to consider making a donation to charities in lieu of registration fee. You're welcome to make a donation to a charity of your choice, or alternatively, we recommend Brian May's Save Me Trust for the environmental crisis, Shelter for the housing crisis, one of the Ukrainian charities, or indeed, as I said, a charity of your choice. We are delighted this evening to kick off our new series to welcome Bill Dunster, OBE, no less. Bill, good evening. Net zero visionary, architect. We're going to hear lots about your inspirational work in your interview with Sash in the second half of the show. But can I start with asking the usual question? Where are you calling from? A scene I recognise very well from my conversations in the past. Where are you calling from? What have you chosen your theme for this evening, Bill? And what, if anything, you're drinking?
I'm phoning from Hope House, which is a house we built in 1993. I'm drinking a glass of locally brewed IPA from the Big Smoke Brewery.
Here's the beer, Maiden.
Thank you.
And what have you chosen our theme?
The theme, IPA.
IPA, fantastic. Well, so I'm laughing at the comments.
Crack it open.
About Stat Paul's face. Looking forward to seeing what contributions to the IPA theme have got in a moment. On which note, Mary, lovely to see you in the town legal offices.
I'm in the town legal offices in the city. Good evening, Bill. Welcome to the show, and lovely to see you, Charlie, Sasha, Paul, and hopefully His Royal Highness, the other Mr. Young, will join us soon enough. I have made a rookie error, and I'm drinking water. I can't believe that I completely failed to bring in my craft beer, which I got out of my fridge yesterday, but I did. So sorry about that. But anyway, cheers.
Cheers. And then Paul.
Hello, Charlie. Hello, Bill. Nice to see
your face. It makes you look younger.
Well, what can I say? This is completely not real. This is a filter from Zoom, and the background is a European northern area because at the moment I'm celebrating the fact that some of us are going to Eurovision on Saturday, and I'm looking forward to therefore being the candidate from the UK jury, and that's my pitch at the moment. Hence the reason for the filter and the ridiculous background. Where I am in reality, unfortunately, is far less glamorous. I'm currently in Spelthorne District Council, where I am tragically just having finished my inquiry, and you'll see, thanks for the comments on the chat, that I haven't grown any facial hair, but I can put it on if Graham Norton needs me on Saturday. I promise.
Fantastic. Can I just say, Rob, to our IT guy, if there's any other filters you can add to Paul, like a sort of Poirot or anything like handlebars, please feel free to do so. It would make my day. Sasha, how are you doing? Looking forward to hearing your discussion with Bill. Where are you? What are you up to?
I'm getting. Gosh, I've swapped identities with Paul. I'm king of the north and he's king of the south. He's in Spelthorne and I'm in Warrington. It's fabulous clerking from those concerned. No, I'm in Warrington, and unfortunately, Warrington don't have. I'm sure they do have IPA, but I've got a base. What's it called? One of those machines. What are they called? I'm having a
Coffee machine.
No, if only, Mary, if only. I know Town Legal, you can probably get 75 varieties of coffee. Here, I'm afraid it's Nescafe Instant. But no, it's lovely to see Bill, and I'm much looking forward to our chat in a minute.
Cheers. Well, so we're waiting on Chris. He's still in the inquiry. Here I am wearing my Ukrainian T-shirt. On the IPA theme, I've got various candidates for my beer. I've got the UK entry, 6 points. The German entry, Lagerbeer Hell, 5 points. There's the Belgian beer, Cherry Beer.
Ooh, nil point.
Spain, Estrella, 8 points. We've got the Greek version, Hellas, 9 points. The French traditional wine, 10 points. Then the Italians always doing something racing different with the Negroni. And then finally, the wild card from Australia, 12 points. So I'm going to say it. I think I'm going to go Negroni. Someone's looking forward to Eurovision anyway. Now, on that note, from Eurovision to West Oxfordshire District Council and the High Court. How about that for a segue? Paul, sans facial hair, you're going to tell us all about that judgment before we get to...
Do you know, I actually quite liked it. That's slightly worrying. I'm jealous of Bill now for having it, so I may move to the bearded one. So I tried it during lockdown, didn't seem to work for me, but I might have another bash in the light of that. So my case is the King on the application of the Friends of West Oxfordshire against West Oxfordshire. So they can't be that friendly. And it's this decision of His Honour Judge Jarman, sitting as a judge of the High Court. It's a mega decision in relation to a challenge against the discharge by West Oxfordshire Council of conditions in respect to a huge scheme of 25 dwellings comprising self-build, custom build, some market, some affordable, and also a 12-bedded supported living unit. It's a scheme which was granted consent back in 2020, and the application to discharge condition 8 of the permission was granted by the council on the 10th of August of 2022, and it was to challenge the discharge of consent. And that's why actually it's one of these ones where it really is worth drilling into what is a relatively small case in terms of its actual factual matrix, but its application is really important because there is a screw up in this particular case, which I'll come to in a minute. The site sits adjacent to an ancient woodland, and the agreement had been in various documentation that there will be a 5-metre buffer. It should have been 15, but it's reduced down to 5 metres between the developed area of the site and the ancient woodland. When it came to discharging the consent, the ecological report identified that 5-metre buffer. However, the application site was erroneously drawn. And it turned out that when the correct application site was drawn, that the 5-metre buffer, so going in from the inside of the application site, clipped one house initially when it was first spotted, so they couldn't achieve it in one area. Natural England was asked the question, well, does it matter? And Natural England said, well, not very happy, but okay, no objection. And then before discharge actually took place, they spotted there was another 2 areas where the application site was incorrect. So there was another 2 areas where this area was reduced. The total area of the buffer reduced was 5% in terms of its area, but obviously the 5-metre buffer couldn't be achieved. And so there was an approval of the condition, which on the one hand approved an ecological report showing a 5-metre buffer, and on the other hand showed it wasn't achievable. So that's the sort of exam question that sits on your desk as a junior member of the planning bar, and you're going, I just don't know what the answer. I'm going to have to ring up somebody clever like Mary or Sasha, or at worst, if they don't answer, Charlie could answer. So you could write it down as a really clever exam question. But what His Honour Judge Jarman said was, well, it's not a matter of planning judgment because this was a precondition, and therefore there was a requirement to have this in place before implementation started, and the fundamentals of the decision was based upon protecting this ancient woodland, and therefore ground 1, which was essentially an inconsistent discharge of condition, was found to be established. There was also an inconsistency with the landscape in the tree root protection area. There was also a ground which was successful in relation to a misunderstanding of Natural England's advice, because it was thought that Natural England weren't objecting, but they'd only commented on 1 encroachment, not all 3 encroachments. But the big question was relief, because having decided that there was an illegality and the discharge of condition was therefore quashed, by the time of the decision, it was beyond the point at which the implementation of permission could have taken place, and a Section 73 application had been made by the developers to say, well, we'll just change where the buildings are going to be, so it won't make any difference. Well, His Honour Judge Jarman said, well, hold on a second, there's a problem with that, because you may not have lawfully implemented the original condition, and therefore any Section 73 application might not be capable of being granted, and therefore it wasn't academic. That's sort of the potted highlights. There are a few more points in this case, but it really is that sort of case which gives rise to a number of different avenues, a number of different issues, cleverly argued by both parties, I have to say. But it really is the warning sign to say, make sure you've got your application site right, and make sure your reports and your plans are consistent, because it may not be that your permission would survive if they're not. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Paul. Well, from one ecological case to another, I'm getting an idea with this decision by Inspector Thomas Hatfield relating to a site known as the former Blackstone Quarry in Doncaster. Now, this was an appeal for a proposed outline planning permission for just shy of 32,000 square metres of various employment uses. And by the time the appeal was heard as an inquiry in February, the council and the appellant were agreed the appeal should be allowed, but there was a dispute between them as to whether the scheme should provide compensatory provision for the loss of existing priority habitat at the site, as well as a 10% biodiversity net gain. And in that regard, a Section 106 agreement had been submitted that would secure all those matters as planning obligations, subject to a blue pencil clause, i.e. one which would only give effect to the obligations if the inspector thought they were necessary to make the development acceptable, and so on. So the appellant alleged that the obligations weren't necessary for the development to be in accordance with the relevant development plan policy, namely Policy 30 of the Doncaster Local Plan 2021, on the basis that the proper interpretation of the policy was that proposals which harm priority habitat would be supported where at least one of a list of criteria are met, and it seemed to be accepted that one of them was met. Now, the inspector rejected that argument. He held it was obvious that all 5 of the criteria needed to be met, given the use of the word "and" between them all, which one might think was a pretty strong clue that they all needed to be met, but the appellant had a go at suggesting otherwise nonetheless. Then the next argument, before I get to the next argument, the other point would note in this respect on interpretation was the inspector considered that the appellant's interpretation of the Policy 30 would be obviously contrary to paragraph 180A of the NPPF. And he held that given the local plan had only recently been adopted in 2021, it was inherently unlikely that the examining inspector had failed to spot a conflict with national policy, and so that was a supportive of the view that the policy should be interpreted with such a way that "and" means "and." He then went on to consider a secondary argument that even if there were conflicts with Policy 30, as he'd found, the proposal was in accordance with the development plan as a whole. And again, unsurprisingly, he considered that argument was without merit, given Policy 30 was a critical strategic policy explicitly aimed at giving effect to national policy. So he therefore concluded that the compensatory habitat and 10% net gain were necessary to be in accordance with the development plan as a whole. He then turned to the question of whether material considerations indicated otherwise, and in that respect, the inspector was unimpressed by the appellant's viability evidence, whereby they'd said that net gain would be unviable. He noted that the range of net development land value between the experts was 36.6 million to 44.16 million, whereas the net gain was a factor of only 750,000. He thought that was therefore a negligible contribution to whether development was or wasn't viable, as it was only 2% of NDV. And there were other much bigger fish in the viability exercise. So on balance, he concluded that the contribution in relation to net gain was unlikely to compromise viability, irrespective of who was right and who was wrong. And he went on to say that in any event, given this was an outline application, it was only when more detailed proposals were formulated that a more certain indication of viability would be able to show whether or not biodiversity net gain would have an effect, bearing in mind the vast size of the scheme. And then he further noted, in light of his findings on viability, the appellant hadn't shown that the other benefits of the scheme wouldn't be able to be delivered in relation to a policy compliance scheme. So overall, he felt that the obligations were necessary to make the development acceptable. They passed the SIL Reg 122 test and therefore allowed the appeal, but in terms that required them to be effective. I think the key take-homes are, funnily enough, "and" means "and." Secondly, it's hard to advocate an interpretation of a recently adopted local plan that's contrary to the framework because consistency would have been an issue for soundness, and inherently unlikely that an inspector would have, after a lengthy examination, failed to spot an obvious soundness issue. And lastly, avoiding net gain on grounds of viability even prior to the coming into force of the Environment Act 2021 is likely to be difficult, particularly for outlined schemes. Net gain would need to have a significant effect on viability. In any event, there may well be too many variables at the outline stage to decide whether or not it would have an effect. So that's the Blackstone Quarry decision. And next up, Mary's going to take us from Doncaster back down to Camden.
Indeed, I am. Thank you very much, Charlie. So I'm taking you back to Camden for an appeal. Inspector was the very experienced and pragmatic Christina Downs. This was an epic. It was a 12-day inquiry. Each party called 7 witnesses. There were oodles of documents produced during the inquiry and indeed some produced after. And as you see there, the development here was for a 15-story building to be used for student accommodation along with some affordable workspace. And currently on the site were 2 buildings of 4 and 5 stories linked at ground floor. This is an ex-Addison Lee office. And one of the things that happened here was that the inquiry was postponed to allow the appellant to produce amended plans to address fire safety issues. One of the things that has affected all tall buildings in London recently is the requirement to introduce a second staircase. And what's interesting here is that the inspector ruled that the amendments could be introduced because she was convinced that they fell within the scope of the appeal. And the amended drawings introduced a second staircase. And the consequence of that was that there was a reduction in the number of bed spaces by 33 to 206. So that's why I suggest that she's a pragmatic inspector, because she allowed the appellants to address something which hadn't been a live issue at the time they made their application or indeed lodged their appeal, but had unexpectedly come into play at the time of the appeal. So back to the facts. So we're dealing with a site that fell within the central activity zone in central London and within the Euston growth area in the local plan. The policies in London and the local plan sought to protect employment uses, and proposals that involved the loss of premises where there was a shortage of affordable workspace, as here, had to show that there's no reasonable prospect of reuse, supported by sustained marketing over a 2-year period. And there was an issue about the marketing evidence, and the inspector was satisfied with that, and also preferred the appellant's evidence, which covered the lack of viability for office refurbishment, although she wasn't entirely convinced that evidence was necessary, bearing her conclusions on marketing. On the principle of tall buildings, those London practitioners will remember policy D9 calls for local plans to identify areas in which tall buildings are in principle acceptable. The local plan in this case did not, and so the inspector found there was no policy impediment to a tall building, and she said that the tall buildings nearby did not set a precedent, but they provided context. On issues of character and appearance, she noted that the scheme had been subject to a design review by an independent panel, but she accepted the architect's reasoning for not following all the suggestions that the panel had made, and she attached weight to the GLA's views, and they hadn't objected. And you'll gather from that the local authority weren't happy with the design. But she concluded that the overall effect on the character and appearance of the street scene would be adequate. She had to look at designated heritage assets, and she found no harm to their significance. She had to look at 2 protected views, and one to St Paul's Cathedral, one to the Palace of Westminster. Again, she noted no issue with Historic England or the GLA. And so she was satisfied on that score. There were some reductions to daylight in respect to the neighbours, but she said it wouldn't be unduly harmful. There was an issue about the adequacy of the student accommodation and whether that would be adequate. And apparently they spent a lot of time talking about the laundry facilities, but she was satisfied about those. She also had evidence about fire safety, and she was satisfied in relation to that. 35% of the 35% of the student accommodation was secured as affordable in a 106. She found, therefore, that this was policy compliant, and it was the sort of application that should be fast-tracked, and therefore no viability assessment was required. This is in the context of Camden asserting that the viability evidence suggested that the whole thing wasn't viable, but she she was clear that such evidence wasn't necessary. There was only a 4.7-year housing land supply, and applying a ratio of 2.5 bed spaces per dwelling, the development would effectively provide 82 new dwellings. The adverse impacts identified were not enough to significantly and demonstrably outweigh the considerable benefits that she had identified, and she also felt that overall the proposal accorded with the development plan. What's interesting, having said all that, bear with me for a minute, at the close of the inquiry, there were still a lot of issues between the two main parties about the 106. At that point, the 106 was in a bilateral form. She gave time, again, very pragmatic. She gave time for the parties to resolve those issues. But in the end, the appellant turned the bilateral into a unilateral 106. The 106 also included a blue line pencil clause. And one of the major issues was about the affordable workspace and the timing of the affordable workspace. Half of the affordable workspace was to be provided at 50% of open market in perpetuity. I mean, that is, quite a significant commitment by a developer. The council wanted all of that to be occupied before the student accommodation could be occupied. The inspector found that to be not necessary in order to enable the permission to proceed. The 106 allowed for students on short courses to occupy the development during the vacation, when perhaps some students wouldn't want to pay rent and would go home for the summer. Again, Camden resisted that. She didn't feel that that was in any way in breach of policy because they were students. So that gives you a flavour of some of the issues. And it's just an example, I think, of an inspector being pragmatic. There was another one about a £30,000 construction bond. Again, she didn't feel that that was necessary in order to enable the permission to be granted, which is really the key test in terms of SIL. Interestingly, Bill, you might be interested in this. The 106 also included an architect retention clause. And prior to occupation, the architect had to sign off that the scheme had been built in accordance with the approved architect's drawings, which the inspector considered would be necessary in order to achieve good design. Now, I can remember many years ago, councils advocating similar sorts of clauses, and it being said that really that they were unenforceable. So I think that's very interesting. So, yeah, well done, all those involved.
Fascinating. Any local authority officers listening, do consider a barrister retention clause too. Very sound idea. Now, Chris was going to join us and talk us about a case in Tower Hamlets, but I understand that he's far too busy buying his gold spandex outfit for Eurovision on Saturday night, so he's not able to join us. So we will get straight to Sasha's interview with Bill. So over to you, Sasha.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Now, Bill, welcome. I think you're about our 83rd guest on Have We Got Planning News for You, and you're unique. I think you're the only guest who's actually doing the programme from a house they designed, built and reside in. So well done for passing that first threshold. Now, in order to introduce you, I think you're pretty preeminent, frankly, in the field of design, architecture, sustainability, and making a material, not just talking about it, making an actual material contribution to zero net carbon emissions. And frankly, anyone who's watching must go and look at your website, because what you've done in your career is remarkable. And I frankly think you're a testament to not just talking like we all do at dinner parties about dealing with the climate change. I mean, you literally walked the talk and done it. So it's quite incredible. And we're really, frankly, delighted to have you on our programme. So thank you for that. I suppose what I wanted to just ask you a bit about is just tell us a bit about your career and how you started in architecture, your early years at Hopkins, and then when you made the plunge, when Sue nearly divorced you, probably, when you said, I've got a great idea, I'm leaving Hopkins, one of the leading architectural practices, and I'm going to set up on my own. Walk us through the journey.
Well, you're absolutely right. Your analysis is spot on. It was a very, very risky and indeed silly thing to do. But we were younger, and we were absolutely convinced that it wasn't going to be possible to really get going with this new zeitgeist, the sort of ecological design movement, if you like. And it wasn't worth fighting the establishment architectural practices. It wasn't worth, it was pushing a rock uphill. And we just felt, a group of us got together and we just felt we couldn't find any other chance to promote this agenda unless we did it ourselves. I mean, of course, that's incredibly arrogant, and we're completely wrong. And all of these things I admit, but we designed BedZ, in evenings and weekends. It was really hard work, and we couldn't leave until Peabody offered us the first paycheck, which.
And tell us what was, frankly, what was the motivation that you really did want to make a change in the way that people approach the design of buildings and actually really made a material change in approach, frankly?
I think I was very lucky because when I was at Hopkins, I worked on a lot of EU-funded research grants. We went into all the best test facilities in Europe. We had fantastic building physics backup from people like Arups and Buro Happold. We worked with some of the best consultants in the world, and it was all being spent on office buildings. And really, the feeling was, well, how do you get all that technology, all that understanding, all those clever people, and get them to design, something really boring like housing? And even better, if you could integrate, the need for workplaces with housing, together, mixed use development, live, work, and so on. You'd end up, designing out all the things that made cities, certainly at that time, not so much fun. And that was particularly at the time, I was commuting an hour each way on a bicycle from, to get to work and back. So these things really. The feeling was we could make all these ideas happen. And there's the Urban Task Force at the time, which was trying to find ways of delivering millions of new homes without using agricultural land, using existing brownfield sites, and that kind of set the brief for BedZ.
And then tell us since that time. What have you been? As the day job, what have you actually been designing and been commissioned to do? What are the kind of projects that you specialise in?
Well, the sadness is that very few people actually come up to us and ask us to design something. So most of the projects that we've done, we've had to initiate ourselves, which is that's the hard work. That's the painful bit. On the positive note, you tend to ask more searching questions than many clients do, and you do get radically different projects. That's not all our projects are like that, but most of the bigger ones have been. So we're at the moment we're building black pack housing, net zero off-grid capable housing, so that people can solve their own housing problems if anyone allowed them to have the land. We're using those construction techniques for projects like Burriton, which Charlie will probably talk about later. And we're sort of really getting our hands dirty, making it possible for someone to build a family house of two for around about 120 grand, and never have an energy bill again in their life, and have some power left over to run the electric car.
Wow.
Why all these things aren't available, on the mass market, I can't. I don't know, but it is possible. And it kind of means somebody has to try. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. I feel like the volume house builders sort of holding everything back.
And then tell us about the future. What projects would you like to get involved in, or what personal ambitions do you have for the practice over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, we really are. We think we've finished the kind of prototyping and the R&D phase, and we're well into looking for economies of scale, and we really want to work with landowners and local authorities and indeed government and solve these real problems. And that's it's that collaboration that's been missing. We've just been doing our own thing and waiting, seeing if there's anyone out there.
And when you say the collaboration's been missing, I mean, let's extend the conversation to the wider general planning world. And historically, have you found it quite difficult to get traction from LPAs, both members and officers, in your ideas and schemes you've been promoting and applying for?
I'd say yes, we have found it difficult. It's a bit like turning up, speaking a different language. I feel like I'm from some remote country that nobody's ever heard of, really.
Really, but do you find is that? I mean, let's try before we all go and do something to ourselves. Try and cheer us up. Do you notice is there a material change now in officers, much more acceptance and embracing of the philosophies that you espouse for your designs?
I'd say there is, in theory, pretty well all of the planning policy is headed our way. No one's got a better idea. The problem is that individual officers lag far behind, and frankly just haven't had enough practical experience of trying to deliver these subjects. So you can have the most bizarre conversations with people that really don't understand any of the technology, any of the opportunities to develop a contemporary low carbon vernacular, and frankly don't are just simply looking for superficial greenwash, or projects that simply mimic the surrounding urban grain, which is important and has its place, but isn't going to solve a household's energy bills, or indeed create affordable housing, or solve any of the wider issues that society face. So it's real style over content, I'm afraid.
In the balance on considering your developments between the factors such as zero carbon or very little carbon as against design, who's generally winning the debate? What factor's winning the debate?
I think what wins the debate is that nobody has a better plan. They can be as critical of me as they wish, but unless they've got an alternative strategy which shows some sign of offering a workable future, in the end they have nowhere to go, and this happens repeatedly. And it's just a question of asking searching questions, as Charlie and his team did, and eventually they literally fold because they haven't got a clue how to solve the problems that we're all experiencing. There's the rising costs of energy, the accelerating climate change, the extreme weather events, the lack of housing. All these things just there is no solution, and we do offer solutions. However much you dislike the aesthetic or the way in which we're designing. And I think that in the end you can only stop something if you've got a better plan.
And tell me about, I don't know how far you keep abreast of training of young architects. To what extent is a proper emphasis given to climate change factors now in those going through their training?
Well, it is definitely changing, and Extinction Rebellion and all of those movements have definitely moved the goalposts, and people are radicalized. I wouldn't say, the existing staff in all the universities had a great handle on all this on this subject, and many of the people teaching don't have much practical experience, which is again problematic. So I feel, yes, it's getting better. Do they have the answers, and are they really learning how to fast forward a low carbon society? Well, I kind of doubt it, and I don't see evidence of that.
Do you, from your, I mean, I know you were visiting professor, I think, at Cardiff for some time. You might still be. Did you find that the student population, are you encouraged by the approach of the younger generation to these matters?
Yeah, I wasn't Cardiff; it was UCL.
Sorry.
Yeah, I am encouraged, and as I said, I'm more encouraged by the motivation than the competence. I mean, we've had a lot of young architects from all countries, moving through our practice over the past 25 years, and we really have seen brilliant people come through and go out and do their own thing, which has been great. But it really has taken about 5 years to get them doing great good stuff, because they've been forced to actually learn to detail, learn to understand all the diverse things. It is completely different to business as usual, in terms of my profession.
And now tell me also, Bill, tell me about the future and what you'd like to see the planning system do, frankly, to get more practical, to actually implement change that's meaningful.
Well, I think pretty well every local authority has signed up to the reality of climate change, and they do have most of the policies in place if they chose to enact them. The problem then is just there's a massive gap in rhetoric between what they say they're going to do and what they do. And really, I suppose the best way forward is to try and get exemplars, try and get demonstration best practice projects in as many different local authorities as possible, so that people aren't frightened, aren't scared, and don't view it as a problem, because frankly, it's no big deal. Most of this agenda is hyped up. It's much ado about nothing. It doesn't really affect very many people's lives, and it makes great benefits. So I am disappointed by the strong reactions that we encounter, particularly among planning officers. I suppose it's a grassroots movement. They will start to get feedback from their planning committees, and the local population that they're out of touch. Sooner it happens, the better.
And tell me, just in terms of a league table, your knowledge of other countries. I mean, how are we? If you were to do an audit of how Britain's doing for its planning system, are we doing against the average? Are we doing better? Or are we doing worse? What's your view on that?
We're probably one of the worst places on the planet right now. To actually make any meaningful changes, and get projects done. I mean, we're working in San Diego, California. We're doing very radical work there with the support of the local authority and the community and the planning officers. We've done work in China. We've done work in Brazil. We've done work in France. it's extraordinary how we are frankly the most constipated country.
Thank you for providing a memorable soundbite for We Got Planning News for You. Now, let me open up. Let me ask Mary, have you got a question for Bill?
I do have a question, Bill. My question is this: what is, in your view, the biggest single obstacle holding us back in the achievement of carbon zero?
I think it's the biggest problem is at the moment obtaining a planning permission. We're coming forward with net zero schemes. Well, we only do net zero schemes. We won't even propose anything else. And quite literally, it is not given a priority by the local authority, by the chief planner. It's
Yeah. I mean, it's not. One might say it's not prioritised enough in the National Planning Policy Framework. And if there was more priority in that framework to this issue, then more weight would be given to that issue over subjective, design issues, for example. I'm trying not to get too depressed. But thank you for answering my question very honestly.
Paul.
Hello, Bill. Firstly, apologies for missing the practice session earlier on this week due to the glories of our national transport system. So we've got a fantastic series of questions in the chat, which we'll make sure copied to you and brought on. One of them is from, we've got Kay, who's asking about retrofitting buildings and talking about the building centre having opened a retrofit 23 towards deep retrofit of homes at scale. So I'm interested in having your insights on that, but I'm going to do it in a very particular way. I've spent 30 years coping with the fact that whenever anybody finds out I'm a lawyer, they've always got a question about somebody's will, somebody's land dispute, or something along those nature. Well, so I'm going to do exactly the same in reverse to you. So I've just moved into a listed building. I have lost my mind. It is absolutely wonderful, but it's got 4 boilers, and goodness only knows what my energy bill is going to be moving forwards. I'm probably going to be bankrupt by this time next year. So I'm very keen on having your insight into the ability of maintaining the historic environment whilst also promoting net zero and sustainable measures. What are your thoughts on that, Bill?
Well, my thought, first of all, we've got to make sure that all the new build and non-heritage existing buildings minimise their demand on the national resources, on the national grid, so it, as much as possible, is freed up for you. And that's a serious point. Second point is, I'm afraid I'm going to ask you a difficult request. Could you please adopt the dress code of the occupants of the building when it was first designed?
You mean as in wearing warm clothes in winter rather than walking around in jeans and t-shirts at all times and reliant upon every space being heated?
No, go the whole hog. Get all the right gear.
Yeah, I like that, and the facial hair, obviously.
Yeah, but do it properly. Don't mess it up.
No, I mean, I'm thinking about our December show. We need to come back to this. The gauntlet thrown down, Bill. A nice one.
No. If you want the heritage experience, and there's nothing wrong, you've got to live it properly.
I will have no problem.
Yeah,
My house was built in 1988, which is right up the epicenter of my music and dress sense. So.
Well, thanks for the tip, Bill. That wearing more jumpers, I love that.
No. I mean, obviously, what you can't do is spoil your beautiful house and its interiors and all that. We did actually do a conversion of a Georgian home that was abandoned in a park in Southend for some artists called Chalkwell Hall, and we basically persuaded them to colonise a number of spaces within this huge cavernous Georgian home. So that they made little snugs, and that really worked well. The disaster is trying to heat it all, trying to centrally heat your entire building. So just pull out all the boilers, just disconnect them, leave one perhaps in place, and that's the best plan. Just you'll spoil it if you insulate it on the outside. You'll spoil it if you insulate it on the inside. You'll wreck the windows if you make them energy efficient. And you could even put one of these special Arctic hiking vests on underneath your new waistcoat.
Charlie, I know you've got a particular interest in colours. What's your question for Bill?
Thanks, Sasha. Bill, you mentioned Burriton before, and to the uninitiated, that was is a biomethane powered electric vehicle charging station and eco-lodge development of things in Burriton in the South Downs National Park, which, as you and I both know, was allowed on appeal earlier this year. Emphatically, the deadline for challenge expired yesterday. Couple of things. One, can you tell our viewers a little bit more about that and your vision for that particular scheme or behind that scheme? And secondly, you got it through planning eventually, but only after a lengthy, costly and uncertain planning process. And what lessons do you invite us to draw as to how we can go about persuading local decision makers to embrace such innovative schemes so as to avoid that uncertainty, cost and delay of appealing in future?
Yes, that is a really searching question. I suppose the appeal happened. Well, let me explain what Burriton is. It's an off-grid electric vehicle recharging centre with a farm shop and overnight tourist accommodation right in the middle of the national park, next to one of the most spectacular hills, which is called Butser, a big chalk escarpment. It's a traffic island on the side of the A3. So it was a good opportunity to allow lots of people to visit a national park without increasing any of the congestion and pollution and small local roads. So Burriton is important because you can't meet the requirements for electric vehicle charging using the electricity supply in rural areas because there isn't any electricity. The grid only goes to high density population centres, and that's why when electric vehicles get rolled out, you have to be able to charge them in lots of places where there is no power. So we worked out a plan to charge the electric vehicles from the farmland on either side of the roads. And that is possible by harvesting biomethane or farm gas from organic material left over after the agriculture and harvesting's been done. So it's basically agricultural waste or crop waste. You take the gas off, you stop the methane from escaping. Methane's a greenhouse gas 24 times, 30 times more potent than CO2. So it's good to catch it. It's responsible for about 40% of the UK's carbon footprint. If you can harvest that gas and use that to compress it on the farm and use it to run a CHP engine at your electric vehicle recharging centre, then you've done a good thing. Because you haven't overloaded the electric grid, you've charged up the road network, and you've given people, when they come, an opportunity to visit a national park while they're charging. So that was the scheme. We were very surprised that did not get the support of the South Downs National Park and the local authority. And, all I can say is we tried, we presented the ideas, we weren't even allowed to get round the table. So that was why this appeal happened. It was a total refusal to even discuss the subject. So how do you get past that? Well, I think we need to spend much more time on PR. We need to spend much more time on hearts and minds. We need to spend much more time, persuading local people to put pressure on some fairly fairly set in their ways, professional planning officers.
A sort of sea change in thinking through about these things. As Mary says, perhaps with a nudge from the NPPF, which might help people appreciate that, or help facilitate that intellectual sea change. Sasha, back to you.
No, well, I wanted to say back to you, Charlie. Thank you. Can I just pass on our thanks, Bill? I think that's been one of the most really thought-provoking guests we've had, and thank you so much, genuinely, for really stimulating both us and the audience with your thoughts. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Sasha. And you're welcome to come back in December to observe Paul wrapped up the nines in his home. In the meantime, thank you again, Bill, for me. Thank you, dear viewers. I say both the live viewers and those catching up afterwards. We're back in 2 weeks' time, and we're looking forward to sharing with you some of our other guests that we've got lined up. We're very excited about some of the people who we have got lined up. Until then, enjoy your Eurovision. May the team that you support or the singer you support get goose plug. But not much chance of that if it's the UK, but there we go. See you in a fortnight. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, Bill.